Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. In 1982, a modest, independent, black and white comic book debuted. It was called Grendel by a sole creator, Matt Wagner, who both wrote and illustrated it. But Grendel is a fascinating story. It continues to return and evolve and goes beyond telling any one protagonist's story. Instead, it becomes a meditation on the viral-like nature of aggression and how it infects those that it touches. This just became an incredibly ambitious narrative that crosses time, crosses multiple protagonists, and tells a story that is more than the individual pieces. Once you put it together, you get something very big and ambitious. Today, we're going to talk about Grendel and why it's so damn cool. Grendel's story behind the scenes begins with humble origins, with the formation of a comic book publisher in 1982 in Norristown, Pennsylvania. Comico launched a black and white anthology titled Primer, designed to introduce readers to the various books that they would soon launch. Grendel was featured on the cover and in a short story in issue 2. Written and illustrated by Matt Wagner, this was his first published comic book work. Grendel is the alias of an assassin whose name is Hunter Rose. In the first appearance, certain elements are locked in place. Hunter Rose is a member of high society who has a costume featuring a simple mask and a forked weapon. He has a shock of white through his black hair and is young and confident. In his first story, he battles Argent, a wolf man who works for the police. It's a lot to absorb to understand this whole world. Grendel is a crime story, but the appearance of Argent lets us know that the world is also a little bigger and more mysterious and strange than your typical noir crime tale. Let's divert ourselves for just a moment to discuss the title itself, Grendel. The name obviously comes from the Anglo-Saxon epic poem of Beowulf about a warrior who fights 3 monsters, the first of which is named Grendel. The poem could be as old as coming from the year 700. Grendel is described as being a descendant of Cain, the first murderer in the Bible. Grendel is also described as a shadow walker, a creature of the night, and scholars have debated his physical interpretation. Some say he was a troll-like giant man, and others think of him more like a dragon. Regardless, in 1971, novelist John Gardner reinterpreted the story to tell it from Grendel's point of view, and Grendel is portrayed as an anti-hero. Grendel is a self-described monster who wants to fit in with the world, but cannot. Matt Wagner does not take any literal story elements from these stories, but the idea of following an anti-hero and the fact that the name Grendel is associated with an aggressive monster seem to be clear influences for the comic. Wagner himself has also listed a direct influence: Michael Moorcock's Elric fantasy novels. Elric is also an anti-hero, and you could think of him as the opposite of a character like Conan. Elric was smart, cunning, but physically unimpressive. He goes on a journey where, instead of raising his station in life like Conan, Elric slowly loses everything important to him. Wagner has said, quote, "Elric was a character you rooted for and felt empathy for, but was evil in so many ways. He was amoral at the very least," end quote. And so, these inspirations were infused into the character of Hunter Rose. Matt Wagner immediately wrote and illustrated a 3-issue run that expands on the story he laid out in Comico Primer. He introduces us to Hunter Rose's backstory as an exceedingly capable young man named Eddie, who excelled at everything he did. Nothing proved a challenge. He loved fencing, and he meets Jocasta Rose, an older woman who seduces him. However, she dies, and Eddie reinvents himself as Hunter Rose, taking her last name. Hunter leads a double life as a successful author and an assassin named Grendel. This second life attracts the attention of Argent, an Algonquin Indian who was cursed to be a beast over 300 years ago. Argent looks like a monster outside, but is noble. He's the exact opposite of Hunter Rose. Argent works with the police on important cases and is obsessed with bringing in Grendel. As the two play a cat-and-mouse game, they both find themselves caring for a young girl named Stacy Palumbo, whose guardian and uncle was a criminal that Hunter kills. Issue 3 ends on a cliffhanger with Stacy kidnapped. The artwork can be a little rough and at times not super easy to follow. Characters are clearly designed though and are expressive. The line art is open and lightly detailed. Backgrounds are sparse, and the focus is on the action. The story in Comico Primer and the first 3 issues of Grendel can really be looked at as a type of prototype for the eventual story that Grendel became. Matt Wagner has the characters and the overall story beats in place, but it isn't fine-tuned. Like a certain director, George Lucas, he wanted to perfect his work by going back and revising it.
Even I get bored sometimes. You think I had a choice?
I'd argue Matt Wagner does significantly better than that. So, Comico at the time wanted to move away from black and white and move into color comics. So Matt Wagner decided to take this as an opportunity to stop and reinvent Grendel. He began retelling the story of Grendel as a series of color backups in the pages of his other comic book, Mage. This first color version of Hunter Rose was later republished and reprinted by Dark Horse Comics in black, white, and red with colors by Bernie Moreau. The story is called Devil by the Deed, and it uses an interesting storytelling device. The pages are laid out in an Art Nouveau style, with large images and insert panels as needed. These are combined with large pieces of text narrating the life of Hunter Rose. They are written by Christine Spar, a journalist who has come across the journals of Hunter Rose and combined them with interviews with Argent to put together their story. Devil by the Deed is a retelling of the original black and white comics. Eddie is still incredibly intelligent and successful at fencing. He falls for Jocasta, who soon dies from a serious illness, and Eddie renames himself Hunter Rose. Wagner spoke about his character with IGN in 2007, saying, quote, "I find it not very surprising that both Hunter Rose and Hannibal Lecter premiered the same year. They're very much the same character, a debonair monster." End quote. Hunter works his way up from an assassin to running organized crime in the city. He kills Barry Palumbo and arranges to adopt his niece, Stacy, who also has a relationship with Argent. As Grendel and Argent's feud grows, Grendel arranges to humiliate Argent at a gala event. Argent falls through a skylight and Stacy sees his flailing body and can now only see him as a disgusting monster. When Stacy then learns that Hunter Rose killed her uncle, she arranges for Grendel and Argent to meet on a rooftop and fight. It proves to be their final battle. Interestingly, the narration points out that the fight was completed in silence, which does contradict the previous versions where the two verbally sparred while fighting. Hunter Rose is killed and Argent is left paralyzed. From there, Stacy is institutionalized and marries her therapist. Her therapist then assaults her and kills himself. Stacy carries a child to term, but cannot raise it, and is institutionalized again for the remainder of her life. We learn that Christine, the author of this story, is the child of Stacy. I think one interesting aspect of the first Grendel story, Devil by the Deed, is that we are 2 levels removed from an objective story. We could probably assume that Christine Spar is narrating this story as accurately as possible. She's a journalist. However, she is basing her findings off of the journals of Hunter Rose. We already know that Eddie renamed himself and recrafted an identity as Hunter Rose and as Grendel, so it's entirely possible that these journals are part of an unreliable narrator. From this point forward, the story became bigger than following any one protagonist, but it is interesting to look back and realize how much passion and affection writer Matt Wagner had for his first character, Hunter Rose, because he will come back and tell short stories about Hunter Rose. And Hunter Rose is a villain, but he's also charming. So it's a really interesting character. He's likable even though he's a villain. In an interview with Comics Beat in 2019, Matt Wagner spoke about what his next steps were at this point, because he began an ongoing monthly Grendel comic through Comico at this point. Wagner said, quote, "As a fledgling creator, I hadn't initially conceived of extending Grendel past the original storyline, Devil by the Deed. But once I decided that continuing beyond Hunter Rose's storyline was an intriguing idea, I knew that I had to do something to keep these stories vital and compelling. I knew I had to keep these things interesting for me if I was ever going to manage to keep things interesting for my readers. And the only way I could see to do that was to continually reinvent not only the character, but also the style, tone, and motifs of the series as it progressed. We even retooled the logo for each incarnation of Grendel. Still the same basic letter forms, but rendered differently to reflect that new particular version of the character's persona," end quote. The next storyline went for 12 issues, following Christine Spar, and was titled Devil's Legacy. For the first time, Wagner stepped into a role as a scripter, and the art was completed by the Pander brothers, Jacob and Arnold. The book ran from 1986 through 1990. In the near future, Christine Spar takes her son Anson to a Broadway show, a kabuki play starring Tujiro. When her son is kidnapped, Christine's investigation leads her to suspect Tujiro. Without any hard evidence, the police won't help, and Christine takes up the Grendel identity out of necessity. However, she soon learns that Tujiro has killed her son because he is actually a vampire. Her anger and aggression grow and grow, but is kept somewhat in check thanks to her budding relationship with Brian Lee Sung, the stage manager for the Kabuki show. With Grendel reappearing, New York Police Captain Wiggins teams up with Argent to figure out who is behind the mask. Wiggins has a cybernetic eye that tells him when people are lying, and Argent, though wheelchair-bound, has centuries of experience. They suspect Christine and slowly close in on her. By the halfway point, Christine confronts and battles Tujiro, throwing him out of a window and losing track of him. Injured, Tujiro is still alive and shapeshifts into the form of a cat. He does not factor into the rest of this story. Instead, Christine grows more violent and continues to operate as Grendel to hide her actions. But the aggression grows, and Christine eventually kills some of the police investigating her and fights Argent to their mutual deaths. The artwork is definitely of its era, stylized and over the top, but it fits the story well. My favorite part about it is that because it's set in the near future, some of the choices are now seen as dated. For instance, there are some very big shoulder pads for the fashion. There's also the idea of floating telephones instead of cell phones. But most importantly, this story shows that Grendel is more than just the story of Hunter Rose. The first story was about a criminal, but this is a story of loss and desperation and how corrupting the influence of the Grendel identity becomes. Christine begins as a loving mother, but becomes a killer. The Grendel identity seems to make the person behind it grow more aggressive at the expense of their own rational decision-making. The following arc was the shortest in the main Grendel continuity, lasting just 3 issues. It's called The Devil Within, and the artwork this time around is by French-Canadian artist Bernie Moreau, who also did the coloring on the black, white, and red version of Devil by the Deed. It follows Brian, Christine's lover. He ends up with a crummy job and is haunted by Christine's death in his arms. In an attempt to understand why she became Grendel, Brian crafts his own Grendel mask and begins going out at night, trying to be comfortable in this identity. He believes he hears Grendel talking to him, influencing him. This is the only Grendel story where Grendel itself may have a voice. The artwork is oppressive and claustrophobic. Panels are tight, and so are word balloons. Brian eventually digs up the Hunter Rose journals in the park and kills a mugger. But he does refrain from killing a witness to his crime. This makes Brian the only person to inhabit the Grendel identity to also actively resist the Grendel influence. However, Police Captain Wiggins tracks Brian down and shoots him dead. Wagner was able to continually reinvent his Grendel story by focusing on new protagonists with differing motivations. It gives us a variety of story types and perspectives with the underlying theme of a corrupting force affecting those that encounter it. And at this point in the story, it may seem like Grendel is simply a story of one person uses the Grendel identity and then another person picks it up, and that person is influenced by an aggressive but unseen, unknowable force, an evil force, which, for lack of any better term, we can call Grendel. And maybe it would have continued that way, but something interesting happened to Matt Wagner to take the story down a very different path. Artist Bernie Moreau asked Wagner if Grendel could infect a crowd instead of just an individual. The concept pushed Wagner to expand on his ideas for Grendel. The next 2 story arcs for Grendel were each 4 issues and lay some groundwork for where the title will eventually go, but by themselves are a little bit of treading water. First up is a story where Captain Wiggins is now retired and becomes a writer. He's asked to write about Christine and Brian, but Wiggins doesn't want to talk about such dark cases from his past and instead writes stories set back during Hunter Rose's era. One follows a diamond smuggling operation, and a second one follows a police informant who was a minor character in Devil by the Deed. After that, there is a 4-issue story called The Incubation Years, where the Grendel force grows more powerful. Christine Spar's writing about Hunter Rose made Grendel a well-known subject, but Wiggins' new novels build it into a phenomenon, and he becomes a wealthy author with a new young wife. However, Wiggins begins to see those around him as grotesque monsters. He surmises that his cybernetic eye is becoming enhanced and is showing him the true nature of those around him. It drives him mad, and he murders his nagging wife. This only serves to make Grendel more popular. Grendel enters pop culture, and we follow the world's decline. Megacorporations start a nuclear war that ravishes the planet. Society breaks down. Churches rise to take the most prominent role in politics, and the Catholic Church also becomes a business, which includes selling a placating drug that they brand as Grendel. These issues feature artwork by Tim Sale along with Hannibal King. By this point in the story, Grendel has become synonymous with evil. It began as an identity, but now it is a corrupting force. It's an unknowable force that wants to reshape society. We could call it evil. At its core, Grendel is self-serving. Another book that came out around this time was the 1989 3-issue series Silverback, which tells Argent's backstory. That was written by William Messner Loebs, also illustrated by him and John Peck. And Matt Wagner began to allow others to explore his creations. There were eventually a series of short stories set in the world of Grendel that were known as Grendel Tales. But the main story was about to continue in some really epic directions. The next 10-issue story arc in Grendel takes place in the 26th century and is illustrated by John K. Snyder III. This time around, Wagner follows 3 concurrent stories that interweave with one another. The first story follows the leader of the church, Pope Innocent XLII, as he taxes his followers heavily to build a massive tower in Denver, Colorado. Simultaneously, Orion Assante begins an investigation of the church. He's part of an oversight committee, and he's a wealthy aristocrat. Orion believes that the church is corrupt and is dedicated to uncovering evidence to prove this. While Orion is not Grendel in this story, it's no coincidence that his name is Orion, like that of the famous hunter from Greek mythology. That's just foreshadowing. The third part of the story follows a new Grendel, who is an anarchist. This Grendel is a low-level worker named Epi Thatcher, who is addicted to the drug Grendel. He fantasizes about killing God, and since he can't do that, the church becomes his target. The Hunter Rose version of Grendel may have been most comfortable with the Grendel identity, as whatever goals each had seemed to align, but this version of Grendel is much more ambitious and is suitably more powerful. Because this story eventually reveals to us just how powerful the church is when we learn that Pope Innocent is actually the vampire Tajiro, who had survived the events of Devil's Legacy. Tajiro plans to build this tower not as an idol, but actually as a weapon to black out the sun. Grendel and Tajiro eventually battle face to face, while Orion leads a band of mercenaries against Tajiro's army of vampires. The tower is destroyed, and Tajiro is killed. Orion survives, having lost his family along the way, but now positioned to be the leader of a new world. That flows into the next 10-issue arc called Devil's Reign. Orion leads the Western world, and this story is a political thriller, as he battles other nations in a new Cold War, as well as dealing with the domestic threat of a vampire nation who has taken over Las Vegas. This arc closes out a lot of the Grendel's story, but it also features an ongoing subplot featuring the vampires in Las Vegas that doesn't really go anywhere. It's a narrative cul-de-sac. It's possible that this subplot was being set up for a future story arc, but after this story, the book went on a prolonged hiatus. The story is framed as a historical text written by Orion's stepdaughter, mirroring the storytelling of Devil by the Deed. Orion begins to feel that he is being influenced by the devil, or, in this story, Grendel. Eventually, Orion defeats his enemies and names his new soldiers Grendels. He assumes the title of Grendel Khan, ruling the entire planet. The story ends with issue 40 feeling like it has provided a lot of closure. Grendel has successfully taken over the world, operating through Orion. It's no longer a desolate wasteland, but it is a harsh, fascist society. At this point in 1990, Matt Wagner decided to take a few months hiatus so that he could prepare for his next story arc to get the book out to issue 50. But Comico ended up entering a state of bankruptcy. A man named Andrew Rev came in and bought Comico, and then Andrew Rev and Matt Wagner fought for a couple years in the courts for Matt to retain the rights to his own creations, Mage and Grendel. Fortunately, Wagner was eventually successful. He did get the rights to his creations, and 2 years later, it returned, this time in the pages of Dark Horse Comics. In 1992, War Child began. This time, a member of the Grendel soldiers has abducted Orion's young son, Jupiter, following Orion's death. The 10-issue story is essentially one long chase, and we eventually learn that this particular Grendel, known as Grendel-Prime, is a cyborg. He was so loyal to Orion that he allowed his body to be rebuilt as mostly machine. His sole purpose is to protect Orion's son from the political machinations that Orion was sure would follow his death. Ultimately, Grendel-Prime is successful in protecting Jupiter, and once Jupiter has grown up, he is placed back into the seat of power to the love and loyalty of the masses, who want a dynasty to rule them. Grendel-Prime is the most unique Grendel in that he is overtly heroic. He has allowed his body to be perverted into something grotesque, and his unwavering loyalty is pathologic, but he risks his life time and again to protect a child against his many enemies. The story does roll in the vampires that had been featured as subplots in the Devil's Reign story arc. Following War Child, Dark Horse has reprinted the various Grendel issues by Wagner, as well as Grendel Tales in a series of omnibuses. They've also published Grendel Odyssey, featuring Grendel-Prime That happened in the last couple of years, and they've also published some crossovers with Batman and the Shadow. What stands out to me is that this is a comic that continually evolved and reinvented itself. It tells crime stories, revenge stories, psychological dramas, action-adventure tales, and science fiction stories featuring political and societal upheaval. The books clearly feature a lot more depth than you might guess from looking at the covers that seem to feature what looks like a ninja in a Spider-Man mask. Grendel started out as a very good series, but grew into something a lot bigger, something I would argue is more than the sum of its parts, because it doesn't just tell individual stories, it has behind it a theme of this scary, unfathomable, corrupting force known as Grendel. I think you could actually jump in on any one of these story arcs and easily understand what's going on and get a complete story. But my personal recommendation would be to start at the beginning with Devil by the Deed. And the easiest way to do that these days is probably to pick up those omnibuses by Dark Horse Comics. This comic is huge, it's epic, and it warrants a lot of analysis and discussion. If you've read any of the Grendel stories, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching me take a look at this comic that I think is something very, very special and deserves to be seen by more people. I'll be back soon, and until next time, keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.